Okay, guys, I'm testing this out here. Let me adjust my microphone. Make sure that this is recording good. Okay, I hope that it's picking it up okay. All right, so to recap, this is what we're talking about. Colonel Graff just brought Ender to the battle school. He's been there for about a year. Okay. While he's been there, he's been spending a lot of time on this simulator where it's this giant hologram and he can manipulate the hologram and he can move ships and command ships and things. And then they reintroduced Ender to his commanders that are helping him out. And among his commanders are all of his friends. Alai, Bean, Petra, Dink, Karn Karbi, and some of the other guys that he worked with in his army and Dragon Army when they were at the battle school. Now they've been doing games for a while. They're beating all the games. And now Mazer Rackham is the one that's running the simulations for them. Okay. Top of page 282. Some of the others laughed into their microphones. Ender recognized the irony, of course, and answered with a long silence. When he finally spoke, he ignored Alai's complaint. Again, he said, and this time without self-pity. They did it again, and did it right. But as their trust in Ender as a commander grew, their friendship, remembered from battle school days, gradually disappeared. It was to each other that they became close. It was with each other they exchanged confidences. Ender was their teacher and commander, as distant from them as Mazer was from him, and as demanding. They fought all the better for it, and Ender was not distracted from his work, at least not while he was awake. As he drifted off to sleep each night, it was with thoughts of the simulator playing through his mind. But in the night, he thought of other things. Often he remembered the corpse of the giant decaying steadily. He did not remember it, though, in the pixels of the picture on his desk. Instead, it was real, the faint odor of death still lingering near it. Things were changed in his dreams. The little village that had grown up between the giant's ribs was composed of buggers now, and they saluted him gravely, like gladiators, greeting Caesar before they died for his entertainment. He did not hate the buggers in his dream, and even though he knew that they had hidden their queen from him, he did not try to search for her. He always left the giant's body quickly, and when he got to the playground, the children were always there, woven and mocking. They wore faces that he knew, sometimes Peter and sometimes Bonzo, sometimes Stilson and Bernard. Just as often, though, the savage creatures were Alai and Shen, Dink and Petra. Sometimes one of them would be Valentine, and in his dream he also shoved her under the water and waited for her to drown. She writhed in his hands, fought to come up, but at last was still. He dragged her out of the lake and onto the raft, where she lay with her face in the rictus of death. He screamed and wept over her, crying again and again that it was a game he was only playing. Then Mazer Rackham shook him awake. "You were calling out in your sleep," he said. "Sorry," said Ender. "Never mind. It's time for another battle." Sadly, the pace increased. There were usually 2 battles a day now, and Ender held practices to a minimum. He would use the time while the others rested to pore over the relays of past games, trying to spot his own weaknesses, trying to guess what would happen next. Sometimes he was fully prepared for the enemy's innovations. Sometimes he was not. "I think you're cheating," Ender told Mazer one day. "Oh? You can observe my practice sessions. You can see what I'm working on. You seem to be ready for everything I do." "Most of what you see is computer simulations," Mazer said. "The computer is programmed to respond to your innovations only after you use them once in battle." "Then the computer is cheating." "You need to get more sleep, Ender." But he could not sleep. He lay awake longer and longer each night, and his sleep was less restful. He woke too often in the night, whether he was waking up to think more about the game or to escape from his dreams, he wasn't sure. It was as if someone rode him in his sleep, forcing him to wander through his worst memories, to live in them again as if they were real. Nights were so real that days began to seem dreamlike to him. He began to worry that he would not think clearly enough, and he would be too tired when he played. Always when the game began, the intensity of it awoke him, but if his mental abilities began to slip, he wondered, would he notice it? And he seemed to be slipping. He never had a battle anymore in which he did not lose at least a few fighters. Several times the enemy was able to trick him into exposing more weakness than he meant to. Other times the enemy was able to wear him down by attrition until his victory was as much a matter of luck as strategy. Mazer would go over the game with a look of contempt on his face. "Look at this," he would say. "You didn't have to do this." And Ender would return to practice with his leaders, trying to keep up their morale, but sometimes letting slip his disappointment with their weaknesses. The fact they had made mistakes. "Sometimes we make mistakes," Petra whispered to him once. It was a plea for help. "And sometimes we don't," Ender answered her. If she got help, it would not be from him. He would teach, let her find her friends among the others. Then came a battle that nearly ended in disaster. Petra led her force too far. They were exposed, and she discovered it in a moment when Ender wasn't with her. In only a few moments she had lost all but 2 of her ships. Ender found her then, ordered her to move them in a certain direction. She didn't answer. There was no movement. And in a moment, those 2 fighters too would be lost. Ender knew at once that he pushed her too hard. Because of her brilliance, he had called on her to play far more often and under much more demanding circumstances than all but a few of the others. But he had no time now to worry about Petra or to feel guilty about what he had done to her. He called on Crazy Tom to command the 2 remaining fighters, then went on, trying to salvage the battle. Petra had occupied a key position, and now all of Ender's strategy came apart. If the enemy had not been too eager and clumsy in exploiting their advantage, Ender would have lost. But Shen was able to catch a group of the enemy in too tight a formation and took them out with a single chain reaction. Crazy Tom brought his 2 surviving fighters in through the gap and caused havoc with the enemy. And though his ships and Shen's as well were finally destroyed, Fly Molo was able to mop up and complete the victory. At the end of the battle, he could hear Petra crying out, trying to get a microphone. "Tell him I'm sorry. I was just so tired. I couldn't think, that was all. Tell Ender I'm sorry." She was not there for the next few practices, and when she did come back, she was not as quick as she had been, not as daring. Much of what had made her a good commander was lost. Ender couldn't use her anymore, except in routine, closely supervised assignments. She was no fool. She knew what had happened, but she also knew that Ender had no choice, and told him so. The fact remained that she had been broken, and she was far from being the weakest of his squad leaders. It was a warning. He could not press his commanders more than they could bear. Now, instead of using his leaders whenever he needed their skill, he had to keep in mind how often they had fought. He had to spell them off, which meant that sometimes he went into battle with commanders he trusted a little less. As he eased the pressure on them, he increased the pressure on himself. Late one night, he woke up in pain. There was blood on his pillow, the taste of blood in his mouth. His fingers were throbbing. He saw that in his sleep he had been gnawing on his own fist. The blood was flowing smoothly. "Mazer," he called. Rackham woke up and called at once for a doctor. As the doctor treated the wound, Mazer said, "I don't care how much you eat, Ender. Self-cannibalism won't get you out of this school." "I was asleep," Ender said. "I don't want to get out of command school." "Good. The others, the ones who didn't make it? What are you talking about?" "Before me, your other students. Who didn't make it through the training? What happened to them?" "They didn't make it, that's all. We don't punish the ones who fail. They just don't go on." "Like Bonzo?" "Bonzo? He went home." "No, not like Bonzo." "What then? What happened to them when they failed?" "Why does it matter, Ender?" Ender didn't answer. "None of them failed at this point in their course, Ender. You made a mistake with Petra. She'll recover. But Petra is Petra, and you are you. Part of what I am is her, is what she made me. You won't fail, Ender, not this early in the course. You've had some tight ones, but you've always won. You don't know what your limits are yet, but if you've reached them already, you're a good deal feebler than I thought. Do they die? Who? The ones who fail. No, they don't die. Good heavens, boy. You're playing games. I think that Bonzo died. I dreamed about it last night. I remembered the way he looked after I jammed his face with my head. I think I must have pushed his nose back into his brain. The blood was coming out of his eyes. I think he was dead right then. It was just a dream. Mazer, I don't want to keep dreaming these things. I'm afraid to sleep. I keep thinking of things and I don't want to remember. My whole life keeps playing out as if I were a recorder and someone else wanted to watch the most terrible parts of my life. We can't drug you if that's what you're hoping for. I'm sorry if you had bad dreams. Should we leave the light on at night? Don't make fun of me, Ender said. I'm afraid I'm going crazy. The doctor was finished with the bandage. Mazer told him he could go. He went. Are you really afraid of that? Mazer asked. Ender thought about it and wasn't sure. In my dreams, said Ender, I'm never sure whether I'm really me. Strained dreams are a safety valve, Ender. I'm putting you under a little pressure for the first time in your life. Your body is finding ways to compensate, that's all. You're a big boy now. It's time to stop being afraid of the night. All right, Ender said. He decided then that he would never tell Mazer about his dreams again. The days wore on with battles every day until at last Ender settled into a routine of the destruction of himself. He began to have pains in his stomach. They put him on a bland diet, but soon he didn't have an appetite for anything at all. Eat, Mazer said, and Ender would mechanically put food in his mouth. But if no one told him to eat, he didn't eat. 2 more of his squadron leaders collapsed the way that Petra had. The pressure on the rest became all the greater. The enemy outnumbered them by 3 or 4 to 1 in every battle now. The enemy also retreated more readily when things went badly, regrouping to keep the battle going longer and longer. Sometimes battles lasted for hours before they finally destroyed the last enemy ship. Ender began rotating his squadron leaders within the same battle, bringing in fresh and rested ones to take place of those that were beginning to get sluggish. You know, said Bean one time as he took over command of Hot Soup's 4 remaining fighters, this game isn't quite as fun as it used to be. Then one day in practice, as Ender was drilling his squadron leaders, the room went black, and he woke up on the floor with his face bloody where he had hit the controls. They put him to bed then, and for 3 days he was very ill. He remembered seeing faces in his dreams, but they weren't real faces, and he knew it even while he thought he saw them. He thought he saw Valentine sometimes, and sometimes Peter, sometimes his friends from the battle school, and sometimes the buggers dissecting him. Once it seemed very real when he saw Colonel Graff bending over him, speaking softly to him like a kind father. But then he woke up and found only his enemy, Mazer Rackham. I'm awake, said Ender. So I see, Mazer answered. Took you long enough. You have a battle today. So Ender got up and fought the battle and won it. But there was no second battle that day, and they let him go to bed earlier. His hands were shaking as he undressed. During the night, he thought he felt hands touching him gently, hands with affection in them and gentleness. He dreamed he heard voices. You haven't been kind to him. That wasn't the assignment. How long can he go on? He's breaking down. Long enough, it's nearly finished. So soon? A few days, and then he's through. How will he do when he's already like this? Fine. Even today, he fought better than ever. In his dream, the voices sounded like Colonel Graff and Mazer Rackham. But that was the way dreams were. The craziest things could happen, because he dreamed he heard one of the voices saying, I can't bear to see what this is doing to him. And the other voice answered, I know. I love him too. And they changed into Valentine and Eli, and in his dream they were burying him. Only a hill grew up where they laid his body down, and he dried out and became a home for buggers like the giant was. All dreams. If there was love or pity for him, it was only in his dreams. He woke up and fought another battle and won. Then he went to bed and slept again and dreamed again, and he woke up and won again. and slept again, and he hardly noticed when waking became sleeping, nor did he care. Let's see if this is... I hope that this archives here. The next day was his last day in command school, though he didn't know it. Mazer Rackham was not in the room with him when he woke up. He showered and dressed and waited for Mazer to come unlock the door. He didn't come. Ender tried the door. It was open. Was it an accident that Mazer had let him be free this morning? No one with him to tell him he must eat. He must go to practice. He must sleep. Freedom. The trouble was he didn't know what to do. He thought for a moment that he might find his squadron leaders, talk to them face to face. But he didn't know where they were. They could be 20 kilometers away for all he knew. So after wandering through the tunnels for a little while, he went to the mess hall and ate breakfast near a few Marines who were telling dirty jokes that Ender could not begin to understand. Then he went to the simulator room for practice. Even though he was free, he could not think of anything else to do. Mazer was waiting for him. Ender walked slowly into the room. His step was slightly shuffling, and he felt tired and dull. Mazer frowned. "Are you awake, Ender?" There were other people in the simulator room. Ender wondered why they were there, but didn't bother to ask. It wasn't worth asking. No one would tell him anyway. He walked to the simulator controls and sat down, ready to start. "Ender Wiggins," said Mazer, "please turn around. Today's game needs a little explanation." Ender turned around. He glanced at the men gathered at the back of the room. Most of them he had never seen before. Some were even dressed in civilian clothes. He saw Anderson and wondered what he was doing there. Who was taking care of the battle school if he was gone? He saw Graf and remembered the lake in the woods outside Greensboro and wanted to go home. "Take me home," he said silently to Graf. "In my dream you said you loved me. Take me home." But Graf only nodded to him, a greeting, not a promise. And Anderson acted as though he didn't know him at all. "Pay attention, please, Ender. Today is your final examination in command school. These observers are here to evaluate what you have learned. If you prefer not to have them in the room, we'll have them watch on another simulator. They can stay. Final examination. After today, perhaps you could rest. For this to be a fair test of your abilities, not just to do what you have practiced many times, but also to meet challenges you have never seen before. Today's battle introduces a new element. It is staged around a planet. This will affect the enemy's strategy and will force you to improvise. Please concentrate on the game today." Ender beckoned Mazer closer and asked him quietly, "Am I the first student to make it this far? If you win today, Ender, you will be the first student to do so. More than that, I'm not at liberty to say." "Well, I'm at liberty to hear it. You can be petulant. You can be as petulant as you want tomorrow. Today, though, I'd appreciate it if you would keep your mind on the examination. Let's not waste all that you've already done. Now, how will you deal with this planet?" "I have to get someone behind it, or it's a blind spot." "True. And the gravity is going to affect fuel levels. Cheaper to go down than up." "Yes." "Does the little doctor work against a planet?" Mazer's face went rigid. "Ender, the buggers never deliberately attacked civilian population in either invasion. You decide whether it would be wise to adopt a strategy that would invite reprisals. Is the planet the only new thing? Can you remember the last time I've given you a battle with only one new thing? Let me assure you, Ender, that I will not be kind to you today. I have a responsibility to the fleet to not let a second-rate student graduate. I will do my best against you, Ender, and I have no desire to coddle you. Just keep in mind everything you know about yourself and everything you know about the buggers, and you have a fair chance of amounting to something." Mazer left the room. Ender spoke into the microphone. "Are you there?" "All of us," said Bain. "Kind of late for practice this morning, aren't you?" So they hadn't told the squadron leaders. Ender toyed with the idea of telling them how important this battle was to him, but decided it would not help them to have an extraneous concern on their minds. "Sorry," he said. "I overslept." They laughed. They didn't believe him. He led them through maneuvers, warming up for the battle ahead. It took him longer than usual to clear his mind, to concentrate on command. But soon enough, he was up to speed, responding quickly, thinking well. Or at least he told himself, "I think that I'm thinking well." The simulator field cleared. Ender waited for the game to appear. What will happen if I pass the test today? Is there another school? Another year or two of grueling training? Another year of isolation? Another year of people pushing me this way and that way? Another year without any control over my own life? He tried to remember how old he was. 11. How many years ago did he turn 11? How many days? It must have happened here at the command school, but he couldn't remember the day. Maybe he didn't even notice it at the time. Nobody noticed it, except perhaps Valentine. As he waited for the game to appear, he wished he could simply lose it, lose the battle badly and completely so that they would remove him from training like Bonzo and let him go home. Bonzo had been assigned to Cartagena. One second. My goodness, I don't think this thing has been picking up my voice the whole time. Is it that? Or is it this? I don't know. Okay. Okay. Bonzo had been assigned to Cartagena. He wanted to see travel orders that said Greensboro. Success, it meant, would go on. Failure meant he would go home. No, that isn't true, he told himself. They need me, and if I fail, there might not be any home to return to. But he did not believe it. In his conscious mind, he knew it was true. But in other places, deeper places, he doubted that they needed him. Mazer's urgency was just another trick. Just another way to make me do what they want me to do. Another way to keep me from resting, from doing nothing for a long, long time. Then the enemy formation appeared, and Ender's weariness turned to despair. The enemy outnumbered him 1,000 to 1. The simulator glowed green with them. They were grouped in a dozen different formations, shifting positions, changing shapes, moving in seemingly random patterns through the simulator field. He could not find a path through them. A space that seemed open would close suddenly and another appear, and a formation that seemed penetrable would suddenly change and be forbidding. The planet was at the far edge of the field, and for all Ender knew, there was just as many enemy ships beyond it, out of the simulator's range. As for his own fleet, it consisted of 20 starships, each with only 4 fighters. He knew the 4 fighter starships. They were old-fashioned, sluggish, and the range of their little doctors was half that of the newer ones. 80 fighters against at least 5,000, perhaps 10,000 enemy ships. He heard his squadron leaders breathing heavily. He could also hear from the observers behind him a quiet curse. It was nice to know that one of the adults noticed that it wasn't a fair test, not that it made any difference. Fairness wasn't a part of the game. That was plain. There was no attempt to give him even a remote chance at success. All that I've been through, and they never let me pass it all. He saw in his mind Bonzo and his vicious little knot of friends confronting him, threatening him. He had been able to shame Bonzo into fighting him alone. That would hardly work here, and he could not surprise the enemy with his ability as he had done with the older boys in the battle room. Mazer knew Ender's abilities inside and out. The observers behind him began to cough, to move nervously. They were beginning to realize that Ender didn't know what to do. I don't care anymore, thought Ender. You can keep your game if you won't even give a chance. Give me a chance. Why should I play? Like his last game in battle school when they put 2 armies against him. And just as he remembered that game, apparently, Bean remembered it too. For his voice came down over the headset saying, "Remember, the enemy's gate is down." Molo, Soup, Vlad, Dumper, and Crazy Tom all laughed. They remembered too. And Ender also laughed. It was funny. The adults taking this all so seriously and the children playing along. playing along, believing it too, until suddenly the adults went too far, tried too hard, and the children could see through their game. Forget it, Mazer. I don't care if I pass your test. I don't care if I follow your rules. If you can cheat, so can I. I won't let you beat me unfairly. I'll beat you unfairly first. In that final battle in battle school, he had won by ignoring the enemy, ignoring his own losses. He had moved against the enemy's gate, and the enemy's gate was down. If I break this rule, they'll never let me be a commander. It would be too dangerous. I'll never have to play a game again, and that is victory. He whispered quickly into the microphone. His commanders took their parts of the fleet and grouped themselves into a thick projectile, a cylinder aimed at the nearest of the enemy formations. The enemy, far from trying to repel him, welcomed him in so he could be thoroughly entrapped before they destroyed him. Mazer is at least taking into account the fact that by now they would have learned to respect me, thought Ender, and that does buy me time. Ender dodged downward, north, east, and down again, not seeming to follow any plan, but always ending up a little closer to the enemy planet. Finally, the enemy began to close on him too tightly. Then suddenly Ender's formation burst. His fleet seemed to melt into chaos. The 80 fighters seemed to follow no plan at all, firing at enemy ships at random, working their way into hopeless individual paths among the bugger craft. After a few minutes of battle, however, Ender whispered to his squadron leaders once more, and suddenly a dozen of his remaining fighters formed again into a formation. But now they were on the far side of one of the enemy's most formidable groups. They had, with terrible losses, passed through, and now they had covered more than half the distance to the enemy's planet. The enemy sees now, thought Ender. Surely Mazer sees what I'm doing. Or perhaps Mazer cannot believe that I would do it. Well, so much the better for me. Ender's tiny fleet darted this way and that, sending 2 or 3 fighters out as if to attack, then bringing them back. The enemy closed in, drawing in ships and formations that had been widely scattered, bringing them in for the kill. The enemy was most concentrated beyond Ender, so he could not escape back into the open space, closing him in. Excellent, thought Ender. Closer. Come closer. Then he whispered a command, and the ships dropped like rocks towards the planet's surface. They were starships and fighters, completely unequipped to handle the heat of passage through an atmosphere. But Ender never intended them to reach the atmosphere. Almost from the moment they began to drop, they were focusing their little doctors on one thing only, the planet itself. 1, 2, 4, 7 of his fighters were blown away. It was all a gamble now, whether any of his ships would survive long enough to get in range. It would not take long. Once they could focus on the planet's surface, just a moment, with Dr. Device. That's all I want. It occurred to Ender that perhaps the computer wasn't even equipped to show what would happen to a planet if the little doctor attacked it. What will I do then? Shout, "Bang, you're dead"? Ender took his hands off the controls and leaned in to watch what happened. Their perspective was close to the enemy planet now, as the ship hurtled into a well of gravity. Surely it's in range now, thought Ender. It must be in range, and the computer can't handle it. Then the surface of the planet, which filled half the simulator field now, began to bubble. There was a gout of explosion, hurtling debris out toward Ender's fighters. Ender tried to imagine what was happening inside the planet. The field growing and growing, the molecules bursting apart, but finding nowhere for the separate atoms to go. Within 3 seconds, the entire planet burst apart, becoming a sphere of bright dust hurtling outward. Ender's fighters were among the first to go. Their perspective suddenly vanished, and now the simulator could only display the perspective of the starships, waiting beyond the edges of the battle. It was as close as Ender wanted to be. The sphere of the exploding planet grew outward faster than the enemy ships could avoid it, and it carried with it the little doctor. Not so little anymore, the field taking apart every ship in its path, erupting each one into a dot of light before it went on. Only at the very periphery of the simulator did the MD field weaken. 2 or 3 enemy ships were drifting away. Ender's own starships did not explode, but where the vast enemy fleet had been and the planet they protected, there was nothing meaningful. A lump of dirt was growing as gravity drew much of the debris downward again. It was glowing hot and spinning visibly It was also much smaller than the world had been before. Much of its mass was now a cloud, still floating outward. Ender took off his headphones, filled with the cheers of his squadron leaders. Only then he realized that there was just as much noise in the room with him. Men in uniform were hugging each other, laughing, shouting. Others were weeping. Some knelt or lay prostrate. As Ender knew, they were caught up in prayer. Ender knew they were caught up in prayer. Ender did not understand. It seemed all wrong. They were supposed to be angry. Colonel Graff detached himself from the others and came to Ender. Tears streamed down his face, but he was smiling. He bent over, reached out his arms, and to Ender's surprise, he embraced him, held him tightly, and whispered, thank you, Ender. Thank God for you, Ender." The others soon came too, shaking his hand, congratulating him. He tried to make sense of this. Had he passed the test after all? It was his victory, not theirs, and a hollow one at that, a cheat. Why did they act as if he had won with honor? The crowd parted, and Mazer Rackham walked through. He came straight to Ender and held out his hand. You made the hard choice, boy, all or nothing. End them or end us, but heaven knows there was no other way you could have done it. Congratulations, you beat them, and it's all over. All over? Beat them? Ender didn't understand. I beat you! Mazer laughed, a loud laugh that filled the room. Ender, you never played me. You never played a game since I became your enemy. Ender didn't get the joke. He had played a great many games at a terrible cost to himself. He began to get angry. Mazer reached out and touched his shoulder. Ender shrugged him off. Mazer then grew serious and said, Ender, for the past few months, you have been the battle commander of our fleets. This was the third invasion. There were no games. The battles were real. And the only enemy you fought was the buggers. You won every battle. And today you finally fought them at their home world, where the queen was. All the queens from all their colonies. They all were there, and you destroyed them completely. They'll never attack us again. You did it. You. Real? Not a game? Ender's mind was too tired to cope with it all. They weren't just points of light in the air. They were real ships that he had fought with and real ships he had destroyed, and a real world he had blasted into oblivion. He walked through the crowd, dodging their congratulations, ignoring their hands, their words, their rejoicing. When he got to his own room, he stripped off his clothes, climbed into bed, and slept. Ender awoke when they shook him. It took a moment to recognize them, Graff and Rackham. He turned his back on them. Let me sleep. Ender, we need to talk to you, said Graff. Ender rolled back to face them. They've been playing out the videos on Earth all day, all night since the battle yesterday. Yesterday? He had slept through until the next day. You're a hero, Ender. They've seen what you did, you and the others. I don't think there's a government on Earth that hasn't voted you their highest medal. I killed them all, didn't I? Ender asked. All who? Asked Graff. The buggers? That was the idea. Mazer leaned in close. That's what the war was for. All their queens. So I killed all their children. All of everything. They decided that when they attacked us. It wasn't your fault. It's what had to happen. Ender grabbed Mazer's uniform and hung onto it, pulling him down so that they were face to face. I didn't want to kill them all. I didn't want to kill anybody. I'm not a killer. You didn't want me, you bastards. You wanted Peter, but you made me do it, and you tricked me into it. He was crying. He was out of control. Of course we tricked you into it. That's the whole point, said Graff. It had to be a trick, or you couldn't have done it. It's the bind we were in. We had to have a commander with so much empathy that he would think like the buggers, understand them and anticipate them. So much compassion that he could win the love of his underlings and work with them like a perfect machine, as perfect as the buggers. But someone with that much compassion could never be a killer we needed, could never go into battle willing to win at all costs. If you knew, you couldn't do it. If you were the kind of person who would do it, even if you knew, you could never have understood the buggers well enough. And it had to be a child, Ender, said Mazer. You were faster than me, Better than me? I was too old and cautious. Any decent person who knows what warfare is can never go into battle with a whole heart. But you didn't know. We made sure you didn't know. You were reckless and brilliant and young. It's what you were born for. We had pilots with our ships, didn't we? Yes. I was ordering pilots to go in and die, and I didn't even know it. They knew it, Ender, and they went anyway. They knew what it was for. You never asked me. You never told me the truth about anything. You had to be a weapon, Ender, like a gun, like the little doctor, functioning perfectly, but not knowing what you were aimed at. We aimed you. We're responsible. If there was something wrong, we did it. Tell me later, Ender said. He closed his eyes. Mazer Reckham shook him. Don't go to sleep, Ender, he said. It's very important. You're finished with me, Ender said. Now leave me alone. That's why we're here, Mazer said. We're trying to tell you. They're not through with you, not at all. It's crazy down there. They're going to start a war. Americans claiming the Warsaw Pact is about to attack, and the Russians are saying the same thing about the hegemon. The bugger war isn't 24 hours dead, and the world down there is back to fighting again as bad as ever. And all of them are worried about you. All of them want you, the greatest military leader in history. They want you to lead their armies, the Americans, the hegemon, everybody but the Warsaw Pact, and they want you dead. Fine with me, said Ender. We have to take you away from here. There are Russian Marines all over Eros, and the pole mark is Russian. It could turn to bloodshed at any time. Ender turned his back on them again. This time they let him. He did not sleep, though. He listened to them. I was afraid of this, Rackham. You pushed him too hard. Some of those lesser outposts could have waited until after. You could have given him some days to rest. Are you doing it too, Graf? Trying to decide how I should have done it better? You don't know what would have happened if I hadn't pushed. Nobody knows. I did it the way I did, and it worked. Above all, it worked. Memorize that defense, Graf. You may have to use it too. Sorry. I can see what it's done to him. Colonel Leakey says there's a good chance he'll be permanently damaged, but I don't believe it. He's too strong. Winning meant a lot to him, and he won. Don't tell me about strong. The kid's 11. Give him some rest, Rackham. Things haven't exploded yet. We can post a guard outside his door. Or post a guard outside another door and pretend that it's his. Whatever. They went away. Ender slept again. Time passed without touching Ender, except with glancing blows. Once he awoke for a few minutes with something pressing his hand, pushing downward on it with a dull, insistent pain. He reached over and touched it, and it was a needle passing into a vein. He tried to pull it out, but it was taped on, and he was too weak. Another time he awoke in darkness to hear people near him murmuring and cursing. His ears were ringing with loud noise that had awakened him. He did not remember the noise. Get the lights on, someone said, and another time he thought he heard someone crying softly near him. It might have been a single day. It might have been a week. From his dreams, it could have been months. He seemed to pass through lifetimes in his dreams, through the giant's drink again, past the wolf children, reliving the terrible deaths, the constant murders. He heard a voice whispering in the forest. You had to kill the children to get to the end of the world. And he tried to answer. I never wanted to kill anybody. Nobody ever asked me if I wanted to kill anybody. But the forest laughed at him. And when he leapt from the cliff at the end of the world, sometimes it was not clouds that caught him, but a fighter that carried him to a vantage point near the surface of the bugger world, so he could watch over and over the eruption of death when Dr. Device set off a reaction on the planet's face, then closer and closer until he could watch individual buggers explode, turn to light, then collapse into a pile of dirt before his eyes, and the queen surrounded by infants. Only the queen was mother, and the infants were Valentine, and all the children he had known in battle school. One of them had Bonzo's face, and he lay there bleeding through the eyes and nose, saying, You have no honor. And always the dream ended with a mirror or a pool of water or the metal surface of a ship, something that would reflect his face back to him. At first it was always Peter's face with blood and a snake tail coming from the mouth. After a while, though, it began to be his own face, old and sad, with eyes that grieved for 1 billion murders. But they were his own eyes, and he was content to wear them. That was the world Ender lived in for many lifetimes during the 5 days of the League War. When he awoke again, he was lying in darkness. In the distance, he could hear the thump-thump of explosions. He listened for a while, then he heard a soft footstep. He turned over and flung out a hand to grasp whoever was sneaking up on him. Sure enough, he caught someone's clothing and pulled him down toward his knees, ready to kill him if needed be. Ender, it's me, it's me. He knew the voice. It came out of his memory as if it were 1,000,000 years ago. Alai. Salam, pinprick. What are you trying to do, kill me? Yes, I thought you were trying to kill me. I was trying not to wake you up. Well, at least you have survival instinct left. The way Mazer talks about it, you were becoming a vegetable. I was trying to. What's the thumping? There's a war going on out there. Our section is blacked out to keep us safe. Ender swung his legs out to sit up. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it, though. His head hurt too bad. He winced in pain. Don't sit up, Ender. It's all right. It looks like we might win it. Not all the Warsaw Pact people went with the Polemark. A lot of them came over when the strategist told them that you were loyal to the IF. I was asleep. So he lied. You weren't plotting treason in your dreams, were you? Some of the Russians who came in told us that when the Polemark ordered them to find you and kill you, they almost killed him. Whatever they might feel about other people, Ender, they love you. The whole world watched our battles. Videos day and night. I've seen some, complete with your voice giving the orders. It's all there, nothing censored. Good stuff. You've got a career in the vids. I don't think so, said Ender. I was joking. Hey, can you believe it? We won the war. We were so eager to grow up so we could fight in it. And it was us all the time. I mean, we're kids, Ender. And it was us. Alai laughed. It was you, anyway. You were good. Bosh. I didn't know how you'd get us out of that last one, but you did. You were good. Ender noticed the way he spoke in the past. I was good. What am I now, Alai? Still good. At what? At anything. There's 1,000,000 soldiers who'd follow you to the end of the universe. I don't want to go to the end of the universe. So where do you want to go? They'll follow you. I want to go home, thought Ender, but I don't know where it is. The thumping went silent. Listen to that, said Alai. They listened. The door opened. Someone stood there, someone tall. It's over, he said. It was Bean, as if to prove it, the lights went on. Ho, Bean, Ender said. Ho, Ender. Petra followed him in, with Dink holding her hand. They came to Ender's bed. Hey, heroes awake, said Dink. Who won, asked Ender. We did, Ender, said Bean. You were there. He's not that crazy, Bean. He meant who just won now. Petra took Ender's hand. There was a truce on Earth. They've been negotiating for days. They finally agreed to accept the Locke proposal. He doesn't know about the Locke proposal. It's very complicated. But what it means here is that the IF will stay in existence, but without the Warsaw Pact in it. So the Warsaw Pact Marines are going home. I think Russia agreed to it because they're facing a revolt of the Islamic states. Everybody's got trouble. About 500 died here, but it was worse on Earth. The hegemon resigned, said Dink. It's crazy down there. Who cares? You okay? Petra asked him, touching his head. You scared us. They said you were crazy. And we said they were crazy. I'm crazy, said Ender. But I think I'm okay. When did you decide that? Asked Alai. When I thought you were about to kill me, and I decided to kill you first. I guess I'm just a killer to the core, but I'd rather be alive than dead. They laughed and agreed with him. Then Ender began to cry and embraced Bean and Petra, who were closest. I missed you, he said. I wanted to see you so bad. You saw us pretty bad, Petra answered. She kissed his cheek. I saw you magnificent, said Ender. The ones I needed most, I used up soonest. Bad planning on my part. Everybody's okay now, said Dink. Nothing was wrong with any of us that 5 days of cowering in blackened out rooms in the middle of a war couldn't cure. I don't have to be your commander anymore, do I? Asked Ender. I don't want to command anybody again. You don't have to command anybody, said Dink. But you're always our commander. Then they went silent for a while. So what do we do now? Asked Alai. The bugger war's over, and so the war's down there on Earth, and even the war here. What do we do now? We're kids, said Petra. They'll probably make us go to school. It's a law. You have to go to school until you're 17. They all laughed at that, laughed until tears streamed down their faces. Final chapter, chapter 15, Speaker for the Dead. The lake was still. There was no breeze. The two men sat together in chairs on the floating dock. A small wooden raft was tied up at the dock. Graf hooked his foot in the rope and pulled the raft in, then let it drift out, then pulled it in again. You've lost weight. One kind of stress puts it on, another takes it off. I'm a creature of chemicals. It must have been hard. Graf shrugged. Not really. I knew I'd be acquitted. Some of us weren't so sure. People were crazy for a while there. Mistreatment of children, negligent homicide, those video of Bonzo and Stilson's deaths were pretty gruesome. To watch one child do that to another. As much as anything, I think the video saved me. The prosecution edited them, but we showed the whole thing. It was plain that Ender was not the provocateur. After that, it was just a second-guessing game. I said I did what I believed was necessary for the preservation of the human race, and it worked. We got the judges to agree that the prosecution had to prove beyond doubt that Ender would have won the war without the training we gave him. After that, it was simple. The exigencies of war. Anyway, Graf, it was a great relief to us. I know we quarreled, and I know the prosecution uses tapes of our conversations against you, but by then I knew that you were right, and I offered to testify for you. I know, Anderson. My lawyers told me. So what will you do now? I don't know. I'm still relaxing. I have a few years of leave accrued, enough to take me to retirement, and I have plenty of salary that I never use sitting around in banks. I could live on the interest. Maybe I'll do nothing. It sounds nice, but I couldn't stand it. I've been offered the presidency of 3 different universities on the theory that I'm an educator. They don't believe me when I say that I ever cared about the battle school. That all I ever cared about the battle school was the game. I think I'll go with the other offer. Commissioner? Now that the wars are over, it's time to play games again. It's almost like vacation anyway. Only 28 teams in the league. Though after years of watching those children flying, football is like watching slugs bash into each other. They laughed. Graf sighed and pushed the raft with his foot. That raft, surely you can't float on it. Graf shook his head. Ender built it. That's right, this is where you took him. It's even been deeded over to him. I saw to it that he was amply rewarded. He'll have all the money he ever needs, if they ever let him come back to use it. They never will. With Demosthenes agitating for him to come home, Demosthenes isn't on the nets anymore. Anderson raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? Demosthenes has retired. Permanently. You know something, you old fart eater. You know who Demosthenes is. Was. Well, tell me. No. You're not fun anymore, Graf. I never was. At least you can tell me why. There were a lot of us who thought Demosthenes would be hegemon someday. There was never a chance of that. No. Even Demosthenes' mob of political cretins couldn't persuade the hegemon to bring Ender back to Earth. Ender is far too dangerous. He's only 11. 12 now. All the more dangerous because he could so easily be controlled. In all the world, the name of Ender is one to conjure with. The child god, the miracle worker, with life and death in his hands. Every petty tyrant to be would like to have the boy, to set him in front of an army and watch the world either flock to, join, or cower in fear. If Ender came to Earth, he'd want to come here to rest, to salvage what he can of his childhood. But they'd never let him rest. I see. Someone explained this to Demosthenes? Graf smiled. Demosthenes explained it to someone else. Someone who could have used Ender as no one else could have, to rule the world and make the world like it. Who? Locke. Locke is the one who argued for Ender to stay on Eros. All is not always as it seems. It's too deep for me, Graf. Give me the game. Nice, neat rules, referees, beginning and endings, winners and losers, and then everyone goes home to their families. Get me tickets to some games now and then, all right? You won't really stay here and retire, will you? No. You're going into the hegemony, aren't you? I'm the new Minister of Colonization. So they're doing it. As soon as we get the reports back on the bugger colony worlds, they're there they are, already fertile, with housing and industry in place and all the buggers dead. Very convenient. We'll repeal the population limit laws, which everybody hates. And all those thirds and fourths and fifths will get on starships and head out for worlds known and unknown. Will people really go? People always go. Always. They always believe they can make a better life than in the old world. What the hell? Maybe they can. At first, Ender believed they would bring him back to Earth as soon as things quieted down. But things were quiet now, and had been quiet for a year, and it was plain to him now that they would not bring him back at all, that he was much more useful as a name and a story than he would ever be as an inconvenient flesh and blood person. And there was the matter of the court-martial on the crimes of Colonel Graff. Admiral Charmanger tried to keep Ender from watching it, but failed. Ender had been awarded the rank of Admiral, too, and this was one of the few times he asserted the privileges the rank implied. So we watched the videos of the fights with Stillson and Bonzo, watched as the photographs of the corpses were displayed, listened to the psychologists and lawyers argued whether murder had been committed or the killing was in self-defense. Ender has his own opinion, but no one asked him. Throughout the trial, it was really Ender himself under attack. The prosecution was too clever to charge him directly, but there were attempts to make him look sick, perverted, criminally insane. Never mind, said Mazer Rackham. The politicians are afraid of you, but they can't destroy your reputation yet. That won't be done until the historians get at you in 30 years. Ender didn't care about his reputation. He watched the videos impassively, but in fact, he was amused. In battle, I killed 10 billion buggers, whose queens at least were as alive and wise as any man, who had not even launched a third attack against us, and no one thinks to call it a crime. All his crimes weighted heavy on him, the deaths of Stillson and Bonzo, no heavier and no lighter than the rest. And so with that burden, he waited through the empty months until the world that he had saved decided he could go home. One by one, his friends reluctantly left him, called home to their families to be received with heroes' welcomes in hometowns they barely remembered. Ender watched the videos of their homecomings and was touched when they spent much of their time praising Ender Wiggin, who taught them everything they said, who taught them and led them into victory. But they called for him to be brought home. The words were censored from the videos, and no one heard the plea. For a time, the only work in Eros was cleaning up after the Bloody League War and receiving the reports of the starships, once warships, that were now exploring the bugger colony worlds. But now Eros was busier than ever, more crowded than it had been during the war, as colonists were brought here to prepare for their voyages to the empty bugger worlds. Ender took part in the work as much as they would let him. It did not occur to him that this 12-year-old boy might be as gifted at peace as he was at war. But he was patient with their tendency to ignore him, and he learned to make his proposals and suggest his plans through a few adults who listened to him and let them present them as their own. He was concerned not about getting credit, but about getting the job done. The one thing he could not bear was the worship of the colonists. He learned to avoid the tunnels where they lived because they would always recognize him. The world had memorized his face, and they would scream and shout and embrace him and congratulate him and show him the children they had named after him and tell him how he was so young it broke their hearts, and they didn't blame him for any of his murders because it wasn't his fault. He was just a child. He hid from them as best as he could. There was one colonist, though, he couldn't hide from. He wasn't inside Eros that day. He had gone up with the shuttle to the new ISL, where he had been learning to do surface work on starships. It was unbecoming to an officer to do mechanical labor, Charmanger told him, but Ender answered that since the trade he had mastered wasn't much called for now, it was about time he learned another skill. They spoke to him through his helmet radio and told him that someone was waiting to see him as soon as he could come. Ender couldn't think of anyone he wanted to see, and so he didn't hurry. He finished installing the shield for the ship's Ansible and hooked his way across the face of the ship and pulled himself up into the airlock. She was waiting for him outside the changing room. For a moment he was annoyed that they would let a colonist come to bother him here, where he had came to be alone. Then he looked again and realized that if the young woman were a little girl, he would know her. Valentine, he said. Hi, Ender. What are you doing here? Demosthenes retired. Now I'm going with the first colony. It's 50 years to get there. Only 2 years if you're aboard the ship. But if you ever came back, everyone you knew on Earth would be dead. That's what I had in mind. I was hoping, though, that someone I knew on Eros might come with me. I don't want to go to a world we stole from the buggers. I just want to go home. Ender, you're never going back to Earth. I saw to that before I left. He looked at her in silence. I tell you that now, so that if you want to hate me, you can hate me from the beginning. They went to Ender's tiny compartment in the ISL, and she explained. Peter wanted Ender back on Earth, under the protection of the Hegemon's Council. The way things are right now, Ender, that would put you effectively under Peter's control, since half the Council now does just what Peter wants. The ones that aren't Locke's lapdogs are under his thumb in other ways. Do they know who he really is? Yes. He isn't publicly known, but people in high places know him. It doesn't matter anymore. He has too much power for them to worry about his age. He's done incredible things, Ender. I noticed the treaty a year ago was named for Locke. That was his breakthrough. He proposed it through his friends from the public policy nets, and then Demosthenes got behind it too. It was the moment he had been waiting for, to use Demosthenes' influence with the mob and Locke's influence with the intelligence to accomplish something noteworthy. It forestalled a really vicious war that could have lasted for decades. He decided to be a statesman? I think so. But in his cynical moments, of which there are many, he pointed out to me that if he allowed the League to fall apart completely, he'd have to conquer the world piece by piece. As long as the hegemony existed, he could do it in one lump. Ender nodded. That's the Peter that I knew. Funny, isn't it, that Peter would save millions of lives, while I killed billions? I wasn't going to say that. So he wanted to use me? He had plans for you, Ender. He would publicly reveal himself when you arrived, going to meet you in front of all the videos. Ender Wiggins' older brother, who also happened to be the great Locke, the architect of peace. Standing next to you, he would look quite mature, and the physical resemblance between you is stronger than ever. It would be quite simple for him then to take over. Why did you stop him? Ender, you wouldn't be happy spending the rest of your life as Peter's pawn. Why not? I've spent all my life as someone's pawn. Me too. I showed Peter all the evidence that I had assembled, enough to prove in the eyes of the public that he was a psychotic killer. It included full-colored pictures of torture scrolls and some of the monitor videos of the way he treated you. It took some work to get it all together, but by the time he saw it, he was willing to give me what I wanted. What I wanted was your freedom and mine. It's not an idea of freedom. Sorry about that, guys. It's not an idea of freedom to go live in the house of the people that I killed. Ender, what's done is done. Their worlds are empty now and ours is full, and we can take with us what their worlds never have known. Cities full of people who live private, individual lives, who love and hate each other for their own reasons. In all the bugger worlds, there was never more than a single story to be told. When we're there, the world will be full of stories, and we'll improvise their endings day by day. Ender, Earth belongs to Peter, and if you don't go with me now, he'll have you there, and use you up until you wish you'd never been born. Now is the only chance you'll get to get away. Ender said nothing. I know what you're thinking, Ender. You're thinking that I'm going to try to control you as much as Peter or Graf or any of the others. It crossed my mind. Welcome to the human race. Nobody controls his own life, Ender. The best you can do is choose to fill the roles given you by good people, by people who love you. I didn't come here because I wanted to be a colonist. I came because I've spent my whole life in the company of the brother that I hated. Now I want a chance to know the brother that I love, before it's too late, before we're not children anymore. It's already too late for that. You're wrong, Ender. You think you've grown up and tired and jaded with everything, but in your heart, you're just as much as a kid as I am. We can keep it secret from everybody else. While you're governing the colony and I'm writing political philosophy, They'll never guess that in the darkness of night, we sneak into each other's room and play checkers and have pillow fights. Ender laughed, but he noticed that some things she dropped too casually for them to be accidental. Governing? I'm Demosthenes, Ender. I went out with a bang. A public announcement that I believed so much in the colonization movement that I was going in the first ship myself. At that time, the Minister of Colonization, a former colonel named Graf, announced that the pilot of the colony ship would be the great Mazer Rackham, and the governor of the first colony it established would be Ender Wiggin. They might have asked me. I wanted to ask you myself, but it's already announced. No, they'll be announcing it tomorrow if you accept. Mazer accepted a few hours ago back in Eros. You're telling everyone that you're Demosthenes, a 14-year-old girl? We're only telling them that Demosthenes is going with the colony. Let them spend the next 50 years poring over the passenger list trying to figure out which one of them is the great demagogue of the Age of Locke. Ender laughed and shook his head. You're actually having fun, Val. I can't think why I shouldn't. All right, said Ender, I'll go. Maybe even as a governor, as long as you and Mazer are there to help me. My abilities are a little underused at present. She squealed and hugged him, for all the world like a typical teenage girl who had just got the present she wanted from her little brother. Val, he said, I just want one thing clear. I'm not going for you. I'm not going in order to be governor or because I'm bored here. I'm going because I know the buggers better than any other living soul. And maybe if I go there, I can understand them better. I stole their future from them. I can only begin to repay by seeing what I can learn from their past. The voyage was long. By the end of it, Val had finished the first volume of her history of the Bugger Wars and transmitted it by Ansible under Demosthenes' name back to Earth. And Ender had won something better than the adulation of the passengers. They knew him now, and he had won their love and their respect. He worked hard on the New World. He quickly understood the differences between military and civilian leadership and governed by persuasion rather than by fiat. And by working as hard as anyone at the tasks involved in setting up a self-sustaining colony. But his most important work, as everyone agreed, was exploring what the buggers had left behind, trying to find among structures, machinery, and fields, long untended, some things that human beings could use, could learn from. There were no books to read. The buggers never needed them. With all things present in their memories, all things spoken as they were thought, when the buggers died, their knowledge died with them. And yet, from the sturdiness of the roofs that covered their animal sheds and their food supplies, Ender learned that winter would be hard, with heavy snows. From fences with sharpened stakes that pointed outward, he learned that there were marauding animals that were a danger to the crops or the herds. From the mill, he learned that the long, foul-tasting fruits that grew in the overgrown orchards were dried and ground into meal. And from the slings that were once used to carry infants along with adults into the field, he learned that even though the buggers were not much for individuality, they did care for their young. Life settled down and years passed. The colony lived in wooden houses and used the tunnels of the bugger city for storage and manufactories. They were governed by a council now, and administrators were elected, so that Ender, though they still called him governor, was in fact only a judge. There were crimes and quarrels alongside kindness and cooperation. There were people who loved each other and people who did not. It was a human world. They did not wait so eagerly for each new transmission from the Ansible. The names that were famous on Earth meant little to them. The only name they knew was that of Peter Wiggin, the hegemon of Earth. The only news that came was news of peace, of prosperity, of great ships leaving the littoral of Earth's solar system, passing the comet shield, and filling up the bugger worlds. Soon there would be other colonies on this world, Ender's world. Soon there would be neighbors. Already they were halfway here, but no one cared. They would help the newcomers when they came, teach them what they had learned. But what mattered in life now was who would marry whom, and who was sick, and when was planting time, and why should I pay him when the calf died 3 weeks after I got it. They've become people of the land, said Valentine. No one cares now that Demosthenes is sending the 7th volume of his history today. No one here will read it. Ender pressed a button, and his desk showed him the next page. Very insightful, Valentine. How many more volumes until you're through? Just one. The story of Ender Wiggin. What will you do? Wait to ride it until I'm dead? No, just ride it. And when I've brought it up to the present day, I'll stop. I have a better idea. Take it up to the day we won the final battle. Stop it there. Nothing that I've done since then is worth writing down. Maybe, said Valentine, and maybe not. The Ansible had brought them word that the new colony ship was only a year away. They asked Ender to find a place for them to settle in, near enough to Ender's colony that the two colonies could trade, but far enough apart that they could be governed separately. Ender used the helicopter and began to explore. He took one of the children along, an 11-year-old boy named Abra. He had been only 3 when the colony was founded, and he remembered no other world than this. He and Ender flew as far away as Ender thought the colony should be, then camped for the night and got a feel of the land on foot the next morning. It was on the 3rd morning that Ender suddenly began to feel an uneasy sense that he had been in this place before. He looked around. It was new land. He had never seen it. He called out to Abra. Ho, Ender, Abra called. He was on top of a steep, low hill. Come up. Ender scrambled up, the turves coming away from his feet in soft ground. Abra was pointing downward. Can you believe this? He asked. The hill was hollow. A deep impression in the middle, partially filled with water, was ringed by concave slopes that cantilevered dangerously over the water. In one direction, the hill gave way to 2 long ridges that made a V-shaped valley. In the other direction, the hill rose to a piece of white rock, grinning like a skull with a tree growing up out of its mouth. It's like a giant died here, said Abra, and the earth grew up to cover his carcass. Now Ender knew why it had looked familiar. The giant's corpse. He had played here too many times as a child not to know this place. But it was impossible. The computer in the battle school could not possibly have seen this place. He looked through his binoculars in a direction he knew well, fearing and hoping that he would see what belonged in that place. Swings and slides, monkey bars, now overgrown, but the shape still unmistakable. Somebody had to have built this, said Abra. Look, this skull place. It's not rock, look at it. This is concrete. I know, said Ender. They built it for me. What? I know this place, Abra. The buggers built it for me. The buggers were all dead 50 years ago before we got here. You're right, it's impossible. But I know what I know, Abra. I shouldn't take you with me. It might be dangerous. If they knew me well enough to build this place, they might be planning to get even with you? For killing them. So don't go, Ender. Don't do what they want you to do. If they want to get revenge, Abra, I don't mind. But perhaps they don't. Perhaps this is the closest they could come to talking, to writing me a note. They didn't know how to read and write. Maybe they were learning when they died. Well, I'm sure as hell not sticking around here if you're taking off somewhere. I'm going with you. No, you're too young to take the risk of... Come on, you're Ender Wiggin. Don't tell me what 11-year-old kids can do. Together they flew in the copter over the playground, over the woods, over the well, into the forest clearing, then out to where there was indeed a cliff, with a cave in the cliff wall and a ledge right where the end of the world should be. And there in the distance, just where it should be, in the fantasy game, was the castle tower. He left Abra with the copter. Don't come after me, and go home in an hour if I don't come back. Eat it, Ender. I'm coming with you. Eat it yourself, Abra, or I'll stuff you with mud. Abra could tell, despite Ender's joking tone, that he meant it, and so he stayed. The walls of the tower were notched and ledged for easy climbing. They meant him to get in. The room was as it had always been. Ender remembered well enough to look for the snake on the floor, but there was only a rug, with a carved snake's head at one corner. Imitation, not duplication. For a people who made no art, they had done well. They must have dragged these images from Ender's own mind, finding him and learning his darkest dreams across the light years. But why? To bring him to this room, of course, to leave a message for him. But where was the message? And how would he understand it? The mirror was waiting for him on the wall. It was a dull sheet of metal, in which the rough shape of a human face had been scratched. They tried to draw the image I should see in the picture, and looking at the mirror he could remember breaking it, pulling it from the wall, and snakes leaping out of the hidden place, attacking him, biting him wherever their poisonous fangs could find purchase. How well do they know me? Wondered Ender. Well enough to know how often I have thought of death, to know that I am not afraid of it. Well enough to know that even if I feared death, it would not stop me from taking that mirror from the wall. He walked to the mirror, lifted, pulled away. Nothing jumped from the space behind it. Instead, in a hollowed out place, there was a white ball of silk with a few frayed strands sticking out here and there. An egg? No. The pupa of a queen bugger, already fertilized by the larval males. Ready, out of her own body to hatch 100,000 buggers, including a few queens and males. Ender could see in the mind the slug-like males clinging to the walls of the dark tunnel, and the large adults carrying their infant queen to the mating room. Each male in turn penetrated the larval queen, shuddered in ecstasy, and died, dropping to the tunnel floor and shriveling. Then the new queen was laid before the old, a magnificent creature clad in soft and shimmering wings, which had long since lost the power of flight, but still contained the power of majesty. The old queen kissed her to sleep with the gentle poison in her lips, then wrapped her in threads from her belly, and commanded her to become herself, to become a new city, a new world, to give birth to many queens and many worlds. How do I know this? Thought Ender. How can I see these things like memories in my own mind? As if to answer, he saw the first of all his battles with the bugger fleets. He had seen it before on the simulator. Now he saw it as the Hive Queen saw it. Through many different eyes, the buggers formed their globe of ships, and then the terrible fighters came out of the darkness, and the little doctor destroyed them in a blaze of light. He felt then what the Hive Queen felt, watching through her workers' eyes as death came to them quickly, to avoid, but not too quickly to be anticipated. There was no memory of pain or fear, though. What the Hive Queen felt was sadness, a sense of resignation. She had not thought these words as she saw the humans coming to kill, but it was words that Ender understood her. The humans did not forgive us, she thought. We will surely die. How can you live again? He asked. The queen in her silken cocoon had no words to give back, but when he closed his eyes, he tried to remember instead. Of memory came new images, putting the cocoon in a cool place, a dark place, but with water, so she wasn't dry, so that certain reactions could take place in the cocoon. Then time, days and weeks for the pupa inside to change, and then when the cocoon had changed to a dusty brown color, Ender saw himself splitting open the cocoon and helping the small and fragile queen emerge. He saw himself taking her by the forelimb and helping her walk from her birth water to a nesting place, soft with dried leaves on sand. Then I am alive, came the thought in his mind. Then I am awake. Then I make my 10,000 children. No, said Ender, I can't. Anguish. Your children are the monsters of our nightmares now. If I awoke you, we would only kill you again. There flashed through his mind a dozen of images of human beings being killed by buggers, but with the image came a grief so powerful he could not bear it, and he wept their tears for them. If you could make me feel as you can make me feel, then perhaps they could forgive you. Only me, he realized. They found me through the Ansible, followed it, and dwelt in my mind. In the agony of my tortured dreams, they came to know me. Even as I spent my days destroying them, they found my fear of them, and found also that I had no knowledge I was killing them. In the few weeks they had, they built this place for me, and the giant's corpse, and the playground and the ledge at the end of the world, so I'd find this place by the evidence of my eyes. I am the only one they know, and so they can only talk to me and through me. We are like you, the thought pressed into his mind. We did not mean to murder, and when we understood, we never came again. We thought we were the only thinking beings in the universe until we met you, but never did we dream that thought could arise from the lonely animals who cannot dream each other's dreams. How were we to know? We could live with you in peace. Believe us, believe us, believe us. He reached into the cavity and took out the cocoon. It was astonishingly light to hold all the hope and future of a great race within it. I'll carry you, said Ender. I'll go from world to world until I find a time and a place where you can come awake in safety, and I'll tell your story to my people, so that perhaps in time they can forgive you too, the way that you've forgiven me. He wrapped the queen's cocoon in his jacket and carried her from the tower. What was in there? Asked Abra. The answer, said Ender. To what? My question. And that was all that's said on the matter. They searched for 5 more days and chose a site for the colony far to the east and south of the tower. Weeks later, he came to Valentine and told her to read something he had written. She pulled the file he named from the ship's computer and read it. It was written as if the Hive Queen spoke, telling all that they meant to do and all that they had done. Here are our failures. Here is our greatness. We did not mean to hurt you, and we forgive you for our death. From their earliest awareness to the great wars that swept across their home world, Ender told the story quickly, as if it were an ancient memory. When he came to the tale of the Great Mother, the Queen of all, who first learned to keep and teach the new queen instead of killing her or driving her away, then he lingered, telling how many times she had finally to destroy the child of her body, the new self that was not herself, until she bore one who understood her quest for harmony. This was a new thing in the world, 2 queens that loved and helped each other instead of battling. And together they were stronger than any other hive. They prospered. They had more daughters who joined them in peace. It was the beginning of wisdom. If only we could have talked to you, the Hive Queen said in Ender's words. But since it could not be, we ask only this, that you remember us, not as enemies, but as tragic sisters, changed into a foul shape by fate or God or evolution. If we had kissed, it would have been the miracle to make us human in each other's eyes. Instead, we killed each other. But still we welcome you as guest friends. Come into our home, daughters of earth, dwell in our tunnels, harvest our fields. What we cannot do, you are now our hands to do for us. Blossom trees, ripen fields, be warm for them. Suns, be fertile for them. Planets, they are our adopted daughters, and they have come home. The book that Ender wrote was not long, but in it was all the good and the evil that the Hive Queen knew, and he signed it, not with his name, but with the title, Speaker for the Dead. On Earth, the book was published quietly, and quietly was passed from hand to hand until it was hard to believe that anyone on Earth might not have read it. Most who read it found it interesting. Some who read it refused to set it aside. They began to live by it as best they could, and when their loved ones died, a believer would arise beside the grave to be the speaker for the dead and say what the dead one would have said, but with full candor, hiding no faults and pretending no virtues. Those who came to such services sometimes found them painful and disturbing. But there were many who decided that their life was worthwhile enough despite their errors, that when they died, a speaker should tell the truth for them. On Earth, it remained a religion among many religions, but for those who traveled the great cave of space and lived their lives in the Hive Queen's tunnels and harvested the Hive Queen's fields, it was the only religion. There was no colony without its speaker for the dead. No one knew, and no one really wanted to know, who was the original speaker. Ender was not inclined to tell them. When Valentine was 25 years old, she finished the last volume of her history of the Bugger Wars. She included at the end the complete text of Ender's little book, but did not say that Ender wrote it. By Ansible, she got an answer from the ancient hegemon, Peter Wiggin, 77 years old with a failing heart. I know who wrote it, he said. If he can speak for the Buggers, surely he can speak for me. Back and forth, across the Ansible, Ender and Peter spoke, with Peter pouring out the story of his days and years, his crimes and his kindness. And when he died, Ender wrote a second volume, again signed by the speaker for the dead. Together his 2 books were called The Hive Queen and The Hegemon, and they were Holy Writ. Come on, he said to Valentine one day. Let's fly away and live forever. We can't, she said. There are miracles even relativity can't pull off, Ender. We have to go. I'm almost happy here. So stay. I lived too long with pain, and I won't know who I am without it. So they boarded a starship and went from world to world. Wherever they stopped, he was always Andrew Wiggin, itinerant speaker for the dead, and she was always Valentine, historian errant, writing down the stories of the living while Ender spoke the stories of the dead. And always Ender carried with him a dry, white cocoon, looking for the world where the Hive Queen could awaken and thrive in peace. He looked for a long time. All right, guys, just recap real quick here before we take this test. Make sure you look for the differences between the book and the movie. There's a lot of differences right there at the end, especially how they defeat the Hive world defeat the bugger world and how Ender reacts, and then what he does, how he finds the egg, etc. I hope this was good. It's looking to be an hour and 19 minutes. Okay. Thanks, guys. I hope you like this.